Now, to begin with, I'm not an English literature person. I'm not a historian. My area of academic research is in an area of English language called sociolinguistics, which means language in its social context. And one of the things I've been doing over the years is looking at early 20th century representations of women, which is how I came across Eileen. Because Eileen is one of the people who, as you will know, is absolutely fascinating, and yet very little is known about her if you haven't read Sylvia's biography. We have come across her in Sunderland through a project that I'm doing between the university and the city council, which is called the Rebel Women of Sunderland. It just really means not necessarily rebellious women, but remarkable women. And Eileen, after a couple of years, because of you know what, has been in the Rebel Women collection, added to the Gallery of Rebel Women this year. And this picture, which you will probably recognise from the cover of Sylvia's biography, comes from Eileen's passport. But the actual graphic image is part of what we do on the Rebel Women project, which is create posters and artworks which go around the town and the schools. And this is part of the project, which is done by an artist called Catherine Robertson, who is an absolutely brilliant graphic artist. Now, to begin with, I'll just explain a little bit about why Eileen is part of this bigger project called the Rebel Women of Sunderland. And this is a project we started in 2019, and we had our second Rebel Women celebration in March 2020 for International Women's Day, which was 2 weeks before we went into first lockdown. So this, we got in just in time. And it's a project which celebrates women in Sunderland and the surrounding area, not just women who were born in Sunderland, but women who have some connection with Sunderland. If you have a look around you, you will find that there are very few representations of women. Women in statues, for example. How many women who are not monarchs do you find in a statue, represented in a statue? And in Sunderland, I had a particular interest for various reasons in blue plaques. And in all of the blue plaques in Sunderland, there were more relating to men called George, not Orwell, than there were to women in total. There were only 2 blue plaques to women. There were 2 to George Stephenson, for heaven's sake. So the Rebel Women project is partly to do with raising an awareness of women, but also my side of it, which is attaching blue plaques to buildings which relate to people who are not white, not male, basically. The Rebel Women project, though, is not just historical. So it highlights the work of people like Catherine Backhouse, who's this lady in the bottom corner. She is one of the Quakers in Sunderland, and she led a campaign throughout the middle and later part of the 19th century to raise awareness of ongoing enslavement of people, particularly in America. So she campaigned for people not to buy West Indian sugar. There was a sugar boycott that she organised in Sunderland. It also includes contemporary women in Sunderland. So this image at the top is of a girl band called Keneki. Keneki is a band which was very popular, sort of a subversive girls band, post-punk girls band in the 1990s, which becomes quite influential for other girl bands. And the people in Keneki, Marie Nixon, the person on the right, on the far right, you would perhaps know her if you know anything about Sunderland. She now runs the Sunderland Empire Theatre. Emma Jackson, the dark-haired lady, she is another person who runs cultural events in the North East. And of course, I'm sure you'll all know the one in the middle, who is Lauren Laverne, who is a well-known broadcaster now. So the Rebel Women project is just raising awareness of women and their achievements and their relationship to Sunderland in some way. So Emma, Lauren and Marie all went to school together in Sunderland. Which brings me to Eileen. Why Eileen? Because if you'll remember when Quentin was talking about the blue plaque that's been unveiled to Eileen's birthplace. That was in South Shields. That's not Sunderland. That's on the banks of the River Tyne. Sunderland is most definitely on the weir. Next slide, please. I can get used to it. So she was born in Shields, as we say, or if you're from Shields, you say Shields. And she went to school in Sunderland, which I'll come back to in a moment because it's quite odd that she went to school in Sunderland. She attended a private school in Sunderland called Church High School for Girls. And she was there between 1915 and 1924. This is an image of Eileen with one of her school friends in her school uniform for Sunderland Church High. Probably in the gardens of Nicholson House, which I'll come to in a moment anyway. So why Sunderland? Why was Eileen at school in Sunderland when she was actually born and living in South Shields? Well, Sunderland Church High School for Girls is one of two church high schools that were established in 1884, one for boys, one for girls. And it was because the church commissioners had realised that there were no high schools for girls in the area. So they set up a number of high schools in the large towns and cities in the area. And this was because there was a growing awareness of a need for education for middle class women. Although at the time when they set up the school, only 1 in 50 women in total entered the labour market, entered paid employment. Most women actually stayed, once they got married, which they did at quite a young age, would stay at home and look after the children and perhaps take in washing. So there were increased opportunities for middle class women, but not necessarily increased opportunities for working class women. So this school was set up. What were these women doing? Well, these were women who were largely wives and mothers, and the school system, although it was academic, was also primarily aimed at creating young women who would be marriageable because they would know how to manage household accounts, how to look after the family. The Church High School trustees set up 4 schools. They set up schools in Newcastle, Gateshead and Durham, as well as Sunderland, and then a bit further afield, a 5th school in York. That sort of leads me to, if you don't know the geography of the area, then South Shields is closer to Gateshead and just a ferry ride across the river into Newcastle. So why did she come to Sunderland? If you want, next slide, please. The school she was going to is this one. Now, this was the school building that the Church High School in Sunderland had just opened at the end of the 19th century. This is St Cuthbert's Hall. It's now private flats because I don't know if you realise that Sunderland Church High School for Girls closed down in 2017. They ran out of affluent parents, apparently. But Sunderland Church High School for Girls was based in this building on Bray Road in Sunderland. It's about 5 minutes walk from my house, so I just wander up every now and again and think, oh, Eileen went there. It's privately owned now and subdivided into flats, but it's still there. And it's in the grounds of that building adjoining Nicholson House where that photograph of Eileen was taken. So why is it that Sunderland and this school is where Eileen was sent? Next slide, please. A lot of it has to do with this woman, Ethel Ironside, and she was headmistress between 1905 and 1938. She's called the 100 terms headmistress because she was there for 100 terms. And she was quite a remarkable woman, Miss Ironside. She'd been educated at Cheltenham Ladies' College under Miss Dean and Miss Boss. So she had become quite liberated in her thoughts about what girls' education should be. She'd also been one of the first women to go to university, where she gained her teaching qualification at University College London. She was engaged in an educational process which was unusual at this time, the Froebel kindergarten system. which was a long-term picture of how children should learn, should be educated, not just 1 year at a time. When she arrived at Sunderland, she overhauled the system that was in place at Sunderland Church High School. She vastly increased the number of girls who were actually coming to the school. They had to build another building. She introduced the prefect system. One of her first acts was to create a sense of responsibility amongst the girls through this prefect system. She also realised that quite a lot of the women who had left the school actually were in quite notable positions in society. So she set up an old girls' club, which allowed them to meet once a year and also develop charitable funds to help promote the school at other points. In 1918, she set up the house system, which was 4 houses, which created a sense of competition and loyalty between the girls. Now, 1918 is something I'll come back to because a lot of changes occurred just at that point when Eileen is at the school. So Miss Ironside had created a very different sort of private girls' schools than you would find anywhere else. It wasn't the same as the Church High School in Gateshead. It wasn't the same as the Church High School in Newcastle or Durham. So there was something about this woman and what she was doing in Sunderland that encouraged Eileen's parents to send her on the train from South Shields to Sunderland every day, over the bridge, over the weir, and then a tram ride from the centre of Sunderland to the outlying area of Ashbrook, where the school was. Have the next slide, please. So what was it? What was her manifesto? What was her agenda? Well, she sets this out in a prize-giving speech in 1908, so one of her first prize-giving events. She sets out this manifesto of what she wants the girls at her school to become. And if you bear in mind that this is a school system which had been established on religious grounds, she's doing something beyond what you would expect from a church school. She says, our highest hope is to send out into the world a race of women of sane and balanced mind. Makes you wonder what the other schools were doing.
Not a lot.
Quite. Able to make a keen and intelligent interest in all that is going forward. Proud of their nation, because not ignorant of its great history. So in other words, that aware of their responsibility, but also the history and why you should be proud, not just a jingoistic sense of pride. Wide-minded and not insular because they know something of languages and people other than their own. Imperially minded because they have been taught the responsibilities and duties of a citizen of an empire, of such an empire as that of Great Britain. So yes, she's imperialist, but it's taking on these responsibilities, which goes back to what she was doing with the prefect system. So setting up this idea of responsibility on a small scale, which can be translated into responsibility outside once you leave school. Eager to read and form judgments for themselves, so independent thought. Able to appreciate beauty of both ear and eye, able to reason, able to listen. In short, women with training and not ignorant, gossiping, idle beings. Oh, heaven help them. Whose chief fault, pray misfortune, is being the possessors of an ill-stocked mind. So she's getting these girls to think of themselves as being independent, intelligent, thinking adults when they leave school, not simply meek girls who will go on and do as their husbands tell them, or do as the men tell them to do. These are independent women. She starts doing this in a number of ways, encouraging this idea of independent thought. Next slide, please. She starts a debating society. I haven't realised I'd done this. It's not the next slide, it's the next line. In 1909, she starts a debating society, and the first debate is that women should have the vote to be equal with men. You have to bear in mind that in 1909, this is just before you have militant suffrage arriving, and it's actually quite a radical thing to do, to have this idea that it's a positive thing for women to have the vote. So she's quite a radical woman, Miss Ironside. Oh, the debate was won by the women who thought they should have the vote. There were other debates which you think, oh dear, that there was one debate which they had, and it was roundly defeated, that the white person is not superior to any other colour. And apparently, yes, the white people are. That's a whole new can of worms. We're not going to go down. Next slide, please. Thank you. During the First World War, the school was actively engaged in the war effort. It did this in a number of quite normal ways, the sort of ways genteel middle-class women would be engaged. Knitting and sewing, having fundraising garden parties, and putting on performances. But they also did something else. Next line. They enrolled as VADs, voluntary aid detachment. These are the voluntary, these are the volunteers who go and work unpaid in the particular sort of places around Sunderland at the time, which we used as hospitals. Hamerton Hall, which was across the road from St Cuthbert's Hall, and the Royal Infirmary. The difference between Hamerton Hall and the Royal Infirmary is that the officers went to Hamerton Hall and the men went to the Royal Infirmary. They separated them depending on their rank. But these girls who went to both, they went to both Hamerton to look after the officers, and they went to the Royal Infirmary to mop the fevered brows of the normal soldiers. Next slide. Now, the thing about the VADs and VADing, as it was referred to at the time, is that it is very sort of high-minded. If you look at the top of this advert for VADs, you have the places they could go. It reads like a holiday poster. They can go to France, to Italy, to Malta, to Gibraltar, Salonika, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Holland, Switzerland, Russia. Exciting. What are they going to do? They are going to be nursing members, cooks, kitchen maids, clerks, housemaids, wardens, maids. They're going as servants, essentially. Laundresses. These are the bottom of the domestic pile, but they are the jobs that the middle-class girls volunteered for. So it may appear that they're going off to nurse soldiers. They probably got nowhere near them. They did this for 4 years. They went and worked as volunteers as kitchen maids, as servants, which was part of their war effort. So they were very practically minded, as well as being very middle-class minded. And there were in total 12 girls and 4 mistresses who went off, and they all got medals at the end of the war for their VADing service. Next slide. So at the end of the war, we have a number of big changes in the school, and this is reflecting big changes in society. We have in, for some reason I thought I'd put 2018 in that. I did quite a lot of stuff in 2018 for Vote 100, and I still have this in my mind. So in 1918, the first time some women, particularly middle-class women, can vote. So these are girls who are being prepared to vote. The Representation of the People Act is the first time women are allowed to vote in general elections. And Miss Ironside addressed her girls. She said, use your vote with knowledge and balance and judgment. So not just voting for the person who your father has voted for in the past, not just voting for the person because you like the colour of their badge. Forming a definite opinion, not grounded on prejudice or superficiality. There must be sincere study of religious, political and social subjects. So it's expanding what religious study was at the core and root of the school. And all women who have been high school girls ought to be ready to lay things down quite clearly for women less well educated than themselves. And that possibly could be quite problematic, couldn't it? And you haven't gone to school with me, I need to tell you how to vote. But one of the effects of this is that Sunderland, by the time you get to what's called the Flapper election in 1928, Sunderland actually gets one of the first female MPs in the country, Marion Phillips. And I've got a blue plaque to her. And Marion Phillips becomes one of the very first female MPs in Britain. And it's these girls who have gone to Sunderland Church High who are amongst the voters who voted her in. Next slide, please. Now, just taking a step back to look at the biggest social world beyond representation of the People Act. Catherine Colby, in her book on gender, particularly gender in Britain in the interwar years, called it the shadow of marriage, and how this was a time when you had more single women than at any other time in the past. Now, part of my research looked at First World War widows, and widows in the First World War, obviously you have a lot of widows in 1921. It's back to its 1911 rate by the time you get to 1931. What you have in a huge number more of is single women, never married women. And you can see from various census returns this comparison between 1911 and 1921. These are population in thousands in the age group who are most likely to marry, 25 to 35s. You have in 1911, you have about 11,000 more women, 18,000 more single women than men. 1921, 264,000 more single women than men. And this is something which is exacerbated for middle class women, women like Eileen O'Shaughnessy, who was at school at this time. Because the middle class men who were officers were more likely to be killed as a result of the First World War than men who were serving in other ranks. So the higher mortality rate amongst middle class men meant that there were far fewer men for these women to marry. And we can see by 1931 that the statistic that Catherine Holden produces from the census data, well, couldn't be census data, from marriage data at that point, is that there are still more than half of these 264,000 women are still single 10 years later. So we have a very changed world in 1918 that Miss Ironside is looking at and seeing. So she's having to look at and think, well, what's happening to the world? What can we do for our girls? Next slide, please. Rosalind Essex, in her interviews with her oral history of these women who were growing up during the interwar years, the people of Eileen's age, she collected testimony of these women, particularly middle-class women like Eileen, and they were telling Rosalind Essex that they were told by their universities and by their schools that they probably wouldn't get married. They were being told that they would have to make career choices of their own and not actually look for a husband or rely on a husband's income. Next slide, please. So what sort of jobs could they do? Well, we've already had an opening up of professions that starts at the end of the 19th century. Teaching was the most popular profession for the middle class single woman. By 1931, more than 50% of women who classed themselves as professionals in the sort of 35 to 45 age group were teachers. That's 1 in 11 women were teachers. It's an overwhelmingly female occupation, which we still have today. They moved me around at the university quite a lot. Up until 2 years ago, I was based in the education faculty, and I know that our one of the objectives was to encourage more young men to apply for teaching degrees. We simply had, out of 150 intake of primary education students, we had 5 male students. So we still have this bias, which hasn't changed. The reasons for it may have changed, but there is still an overwhelmingly female profession. Other female-orientated occupations were things such as nursing, particularly building on skills that these women had obtained during the First World War. Social welfare workers. There is no NHS at this point, but you have the beginnings of the NHS and the DSS through various social measures that were introduced, starting with Lloyd George in 1909, where he was trying to stop the expense of the workhouse system. And midwives, so another form of nursing, and that's always been a female occupation, midwifery. In fact, it was by law a female occupation up until 1995. Men couldn't be midwives up until 1995. The problem with this is that there was a marriage bar. So if you got married and you were a teacher, you had to leave. If you got married and were a nurse, you had to leave. Even in the higher professions, so the civil service, the professions that paid much more than nursing and teaching, there was a marriage bar up until the end of the Second World War. If you got married whilst you were a civil servant, if you were a woman, you had to leave. So this meant that there was a juggling of career or marriage that these women were going to have to face. You still have, at this point, before the Gender Equality Wages Acts of the 1970s, women earning between 60 and 80% less than men for doing the same job. I tell my students don't believe this, and I say, well, think about education. If you're going to go and be a teacher, you have unions which still mark this gender difference. The NUS-UWT is one union, but it's the National Union of Schoolmasters, the Union of Women Teachers. Why were they different? Because they had different jobs. They were doing the same teaching job, but they were earning far less. They had different rights to fight for, and the unions were set up to fight for these rights for women compared with men. Next slide, please. So you've got this problem of women in the interwar years, single women, and there were a lot of them. We have representations of single women in novels and in journalism around this time, which are divided into one of three categories by and large. They are to be pitied because they aren't married. So the institution of marriage is still very firmly a priority for these women. But they are referred to, these single women, often as imaginary widows. You find them in novels that are to do with schools, as the single woman is the teacher in the school who must be pitied. She'll have a photograph probably on her desk, which will be her deceased fiance who'd been killed in the First World War. Probably a little black frame photograph. You see this image coming up quite a lot in school stories for children. So she was to be pitied, an imaginary widow. This is a phrase that Catherine Holden comes up with. Or they are a danger to society. There is no man to control them. What do you do? They're earning money. There's no man to tell them how to spend it. They become flappers, and popularly referred to as flappers. Women who apparently have fun. Heaven help us, a woman who had fun. The 1928 general election is the first time you have equality between men and women when they can vote. And it's referred to as the flapper election. And what was the result going to be? Because these are women who really, they've got no man to tell them how to vote. What can we do? The flapper election of 1928. Yeah. The cartoons around that are just astonishing. Or you have the single woman who is both pitied and feared. She is sexually repressed, she's untrustworthy, she's unreliable in some way. So she is single, but there is something in her past beyond this imaginary widowhood, which has led to her being single. And really, you can't trust her. Next slide, please. Which is where Orwell comes in. You probably all come across the character of Dorothy Hare in Clergyman's Daughter. And that's exactly what he does. He uses this prudish, frigid spinster character who rejects marriage. And there is hidden somewhere in her past, this hint of sexual repression because of some experience. He talks about the abnormality of the spinster. So this is 1935. This is the year he meets Eileen. And of course, Eileen was 30 in 1935. And so she was a single woman in 1935, just at the point where Orwell is writing about the abnormality of the single woman who is 30 years old. So, going back to Sunderland and Sunderland Church High, what did Miss Ironside do? Well, next slide, please. She produced a system of scholarships to encourage girls to leave school and go to university, so to further their careers, to give them opportunities which would be open to them in the higher professions such as the civil service or teaching. She also gave a financial reward for girls to go to university, which essentially was particularly aimed at girls who would go to Oxford or Cambridge. Primarily, they were trying to get them to go to Oxford because Oxford and Cambridge didn't allow women to obtain degrees at this point. It's only 1920 that Oxford allowed women to graduate. You could go to university and do the degree course, but you couldn't graduate. I don't know if anybody's ever come across the fantastic group of women who graduated from Oxford in 1920, but they include some absolutely astonishing women. Dorothy L. Sayers is part of that cohort. Vera Brittain is another one who goes through. Winifred Holtby. These amazing women, novelists, are ones who graduate in 1920 from Oxford, because they couldn't graduate from Cambridge. You had to wait till 1948 to graduate from Cambridge. But there were still these scholarships, and particularly an emphasis on going to Oxford or Cambridge, which we still have in society, where these two universities are regarded as being the epitome of achievement. This was still the case when Miss Ironside took over. Even though the girls couldn't graduate, they were going and getting an education, making the social links of those two universities, which would stand them in good stead. So the particular scholarships, next slide, that they had at Sunderland Church High, the Everett Scholarship, which was for £50 a year. And this was a donation in 1919 by Mr. and Mrs. Everett, who wanted to further the career of girls. And they introduced the scholarship as an almost thanks offering because one of their sons had returned safely from the war. And they donated £1,000, which was set up to produce a scholarship in their name or his name to encourage girls to go to university. The All Girls Network by this point had grown to such a size that they were getting a lot of money beyond just the annual dinner that they would go to. And the All Girls Network themselves introduced a scholarship in 1918 to encourage more girls to go to university, and that was £20 a year. The Everett Scholarship was only awarded to Oxbridge, so Oxford or Cambridge entrants. The Old Girls Scholarship wasn't as restrictive, it was any university. So next slide, please. Oh, just a slide, two slides missing. Go back. Oh, I am sorry, there are two slides missing. Oh no, if you go back again, I'll just go back to what I was going to say about Eileen. Sorry, they're in a different order in my head. Lots of things are in a different order in my head. Doesn't necessarily reflect reality. Eileen, then. Eileen is really lucky to have gone to this school under this head teacher at this time. By the time she left school in 1924, she was head girl. She was head prefect. So this system that Miss Ironside had set up in 1908, Eileen was not only head girl, but she was head of prefects. She was sub-editor of the school magazine. She had been editor of it, but she had stepped down from that lead role to concentrate on her university entrance exams. She was house captain for Swift, which is the one of the 4 houses that Miss Ironside had set up. So she was a leader. She was someone who was a leader who was creative. And she was also president of the League of Nations branch, so politically engaged, as well as being engaged in the arts. Next slide then, please. We'll get there eventually. Now, the Everett Scholarship Board is one that you can see. It's a bit dusty because the first time I saw these, they were in a storeroom in the back of one of the buildings that had been Sunderland Church High School. And you can just see where I was rubbing the dust off. You see the names underneath. It's propped up against a radiator at this point. It's no longer propped up against a radiator. You can see 1926, Eileen O'Shaughnessy is one of the recipients whose name appears on there for the Everett Scholarship, that £50 a year scholarship set up in 1919 by the Everett family. Next slide, please. There somewhere. It's my fault, they're quite big files and they're high quality images, but it made sense when I was doing it. This is the Old Girls Scholarship, and there we've got Eileen again. 1925, they're sort of in the wrong order. 1925, this is the £20 a year scholarship. She got that scholarship, which took her, she received that £20 a year every year that she was at Oxford. Now, she is the only person who appears to have both scholarships. And I have a feeling that they changed the rules after Eileen. Because in one of the histories of Sunderland Church High School, it explicitly says it couldn't be given to the same person. The person who got the Everett Scholarship couldn't get the Old Girls Scholarship and vice versa. Eileen did. And I have a feeling that she was just such a star pupil that they thought at the end of it, it was a bit greedy to do it to the same person. So she's the only person whose name appears on both scholarships. Next slide, please. Now, these are now shown, they're on display in this building, which is Langham Tower. Langham Tower is next door to Nicholson House, which is next door to St Cuthbert's Hall. These were all part of the Sunderland Church High School. St Cuthbert's Hall is the only one that was purpose-built for the school. Nicholson House had been there for about 100 years before the high school took it over, and it had big gardens, so that was used by the school. And then latterly, they bought Langham Tower. If anybody knows the northeast of England, you might recognise the design of this building, Cragside House. The person who owned this building, or who commissioned this building, was quite fond of Cragside House, which was it was the home of the Armstrong family. They had built for them in Northumberland, and was the first house to be powered by electricity, which they generated themselves from the hydroelectricity. Now, the person who owned this house, you can't see it very well on this photo because I'm actually standing in the car park, which is at the bottom of the bank. But there is a big tower at the top, and which is what's called Langham Tower. And he built this designed it with a tower so he could see his ships coming in and out of the river. He was a ship's merchant, so he was almost the equivalent of a chandler. Anyway, this is now, it's just been taken over as a sort of trendy bar thing. And the those boards that I showed you with the scholarships on are in one of the rooms. The room that's on the far right on here is the old dining room, which has an amazing beaten copper ceiling to it. And they're on the wall, along with a few other boards with Eileen's name on. And they're actually in the process of renaming that room the Eileen O'Shaughnessy Bar. I spent quite a long time in there. But this is a building that I'm very fond of for various reasons. It used to be part of the university. It was reserved for the executive. The university owned it for a while. It was a teacher training. It's a really badly designed internal structure to the building, which meant it was impossible to live in as a domestic residence. So the person who first owned the building only lived in it for 20 years, then gave it to the teacher training college because it was so badly designed. And then that teacher training college became part of the university, and it became a sort of an admin block. And the place at the very far end, which was the dining room, was the dean's office, and she would just sit in what's an enormous fireplace alcove, and she would sit at the desk, and every time you had to go and see the dean, you'd have to walk along this very long walk across the room to see her. She made you appreciate that you were inferior. Next slide, please. So what next are we doing with Eileen? Well, she was one of the Rebel Women for this year, hence the Catherine Robertson poster. And the next thing that I'm doing is another of my blue plaques. I'm in discussion with the foundry at the moment to design the plaque, and they sent me this mock-up of it a couple of days ago. And this is going to go on the wall, not of St Cuthbert's Hall, but of Langham Tower, that big building I've just shown you. That's because the plaques are in there, and it sort of creates a coherence, a public building, a publicly accessible building, rather than a private residence. So we're going to have a plaque to Eileen on the wall of Langham Tower outside, and eventually that's going to be later on this year. And then we're going to have lots of local schools involved in writing about Eileen, which we started doing earlier on this year. And they are particularly keen to be involved because, of course, Animal Farm is a core text on GCSE English. So they are keen to engage their children and their pupils in a bit of local history, and also that link between this person who went to school in Sunderland and a book that they're reading as part of their exam studies. So why Eileen? Well, she's just brilliant. And why Sunderland? Well, it comes back to Miss Ironside and Eileen being in a certain place at a certain time, and that particular period, at the rise of women's suffrage, 1909, when they have that debate, is really when her parents would have been thinking about where to send her to school. And this was a school that had a dominant, very radical head teacher in it. Sort of subversively radical. She should be one of my Rebel Women. But Eileen was in the right place at the right time to get this education, to have these opportunities, to have these scholarships that allowed her to go to university. And it, in the end, goes and lives in London, and that's where she meets Eric Blair. So a blue plaque, another one to Eileen. Okay, thank you.